The women who refused to be beautiful for decades, American television worshipped one kind of woman: slim, polished, silent unless spoken to. Then a handful of comedians walked onto the country's most-watched stage and broke every rule of it on purpose. They weren't hiding their features, their weight, or their age. They were weaponizing them. Audiences didn't just laugh at their jokes. They laughed at the sheer nerve of it. This is the story of 7 performers who turned unconventional into an art form, and in doing so, rewrote what American comedy was allowed to look like. Actor 1, Joan Rivers. Before she became known for the razor-sharp red carpet commentary, before "Can We Talk" became her signature line, Joan Rivers was a struggling comedian from Brooklyn who had been told, repeatedly, that she wasn't pretty enough for television. She turned that rejection into her act. Rivers built an early comic persona around self-deprecation, jokes about being overlooked, about disappointing her parents by not being a beauty, about desperately searching for a husband. It was raw, anxious material, delivered at a rapid, almost panic pace that became her trademark. Her breakthrough came in 1965 when she appeared on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. Carson was so taken with her that he told her on air she was going to be a star, and largely, she was right to believe him. She became a frequent guest and eventually a substitute host, one of the most prominent women in late-night television at a time when there were almost none. The partnership didn't last. In 1986, Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night show on the fledgling Fox network without telling Carson first. He never forgave her. NBC blacklisted her, and Carson reportedly never spoke to her again. It's one of the most famous fallouts in television history, and it defined the rest of her career as much as her comedy did. Rivers spent the following decades rebuilding, through tragedy, including her husband's suicide in 1987, and through reinvention as a fashion critic and plastic surgery advocate who was just as merciless about her own face as she'd once been about her ugly duckling years. She worked until days before her death in 2014, at 81, having never stopped performing self-deprecating comedy that started as insecurity and became an empire. But Rivers wasn't the only comedian to turn a body Hollywood rejected into a weapon. One performer took it even further and paid for it with her life. Actor 2, Totie Fields. Totie Fields never apologized for her size. At a time when American television was saturated with thin, demure leading ladies, Fields, under 5 feet tall and unmistakably heavy-set, built a stand-up career on refusing to shrink, literally or figuratively. Her act leaned into her body rather than around it. She joked about food, about diets she had no intention of following, and about being more woman than her audiences could handle. She was a frequent and beloved guest of Johnny Carson's throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, one of the most consistently booked comedians of her generation. Then, in the mid-1970s, her health began to fail. Fields suffered a series of medical crises tied to complications from diabetes and vascular disease, culminating in the amputation of one of her legs in 1976. What happened next became one of the more remarkable comebacks in television history. Fields returned to the stage and to Carson's show in a wheelchair and kept working the same self-deprecating material, now folding her disability into the act as well. Audiences didn't see a diminished performer. They saw the same defiant comic who had never needed anyone's approval. Totie Fields died of a heart attack in 1978 at 48, just 2 years after the amputation, and not long after her return to the stage. Her willingness to joke about her body until the very end left an impression on Carson and on American audiences that outlasted her far too short career. Not every performer who broke the beauty mold did it through vulnerability, though. One built an entire alter ego just to say the things a beautiful woman never could. Actor 3, Ruth Buzzi. Ruth Buzzi wasn't an unconventional-looking woman pretending to be a comedian. She was, by most accounts, an attractive, classically trained performer who chose ugliness as a costume. Her most famous creation, Gladys Ormsby, debuted on the sketch show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In in the late 1960s, a dowdy, hairnet-wearing spinster in a drab cardigan, perpetually suspicious of men and prone to walloping them with her purse. The character became one of the most recognizable of the show's ensemble, and Buzzi carried her, and other frumpy, cranky character work, into guest appearances well beyond Laugh-In, including spots on The Tonight Show. What made Gladys work was the contrast. Buzzi could transform in seconds, hunching her shoulders, dropping her voice, twisting her expression into a permanent scowl, and the glamorous woman underneath would simply vanish. She described the character in later interviews as a kind of shield. Gladys could be rude, suspicious, and combative in ways a beautiful woman on television in that era wasn't permitted to be. Buzzy's choice to build a career partly around deliberate unglamour, at the peak of her own attractiveness, made her something rarer than a comedian who simply looked different, a performer who proved ugliness could be a craft, not just a circumstance. But if Buzzy proved unbeauty could be a costume, one performer used raw physical presence, no character, no wig, no gimmick, to genuinely unsettle America's most composed television host. Actor 4, Sandra Bernhard. By the late 1980s, Sandra Bernhard had built a reputation as one of the most confrontational performers in comedy, and her Tonight Show appearances reflected it. Bernhard didn't fit the "so ugly it's funny" mold of Diller or Fields, nor the self-deprecating anxiety of Rivers. Her look was angular and aggressive, a wide, distinctive smile, a gap between her front teeth, sharp features she leaned into rather than softened, paired with a stage persona that was overtly sexual, combative, and entirely unapologetic. Where most guests deferred to Carson's control of the interview, Bernhard was known for flipping that dynamic, steering conversations toward provocative territory, and openly playing with the tension of making her host visibly uncomfortable. It was a deliberate part of her act, using confidence and physical presence, rather than jokes about her own appearance, to dominate a room. Bernhard's persona anticipated a shift in how female comedians would be allowed to present themselves, less self-deprecating, more confrontational. That would become far more common in the decades after her Tonight Show appearances. She went on to a long career spanning stand-up, acting, including a groundbreaking recurring role on Roseanne and cabaret performance. Speaking of Roseanne, one of Bernhard's most famous later collaborators had already redefined unglamorous on her own terms on the very same stage. Actor 5, Roseanne Barr. In 1985, Roseanne Barr walked onto The Tonight Show with an act built entirely around demolishing the sitcom fantasy of the perfect American housewife. Where the domestic sitcoms of the era featured women in pressed aprons, smiling over home-baked meals, Barr's stand-up persona was deliberately disheveled, short hair, plain clothes, a flat, nasal, complaint-laden delivery. She called herself a domestic goddess, a title dripped in irony, and built jokes around resentment toward housework, marriage, and motherhood that most television at the time refused to acknowledge women actually felt. Her Tonight Show appearance was a breakout moment. Carson responded well to her blunt, deadpan delivery, and the appearance helped launch her toward the sitcom that would make her a household name. Roseanne, which premiered in 1988 and became one of the most successful and influential shows of its decade, largely because it carried the same unvarnished, working-class honesty from her stand-up onto network television. Barr never presented herself as glamorous, and that was the entire point. She represented millions of women exhausted by the expectation that they should be. Her refusal to perform prettiness, on stage or on television, helped open the door for a generation of comedians who didn't play by the old rules either. That defiance had a predecessor, a comedian a generation earlier, who had already proven that a wig sticking straight up and a wild cackle could conquer Hollywood before Roseanne ever picked up a microphone. Actor 6, Phyllis Diller. If there was an originator of this entire tradition, it was Phyllis Diller. Diller didn't begin performing stand-up until her late 30s, after years as a homemaker, and she'd built her persona almost entirely around visual and verbal self-mockery. Her signature look, a wild teased blonde wig, garish mismatched outfits, and a long cigarette holder, was designed to look like a fashion catastrophe on purpose. She was a frequent and beloved guest of Johnny Carson's from the 1960s through the 1980s, appearing on the show dozens of times. Her act centered on an invented husband, Fawn, and endless jokes about her own appearance, cooking, and housekeeping, delivered in her distinctive, cackling laugh, which became as recognizable as any of her jokes. What set Diller apart was that she never played the victim of her own looks. Unlike Rivers' anxious, ugly duckling persona, Diller's ugliness was gleeful and confident. She got there first, before anyone in the audience could laugh at her, and turned herself into the joke's author rather than its target. Diller performed stand-up for over 5 decades, retiring in 2002 and continuing other creative work until her death in 2012 at age 95. She's widely credited by later comedians, including several on this list, as the performer who proved a woman could build a massive career by refusing outright to be conventionally attractive on stage. There was one more performer, though, who took the opposite approach entirely, not refusing beauty, but exaggerating it into something almost cartoonish. Actor 7, Carol Channing. Carol Channing never claimed to be unattractive. Instead, she turned glamour itself into a punchline. Best known for originating the role of Lorelei Lee in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes on Broadway, and for her Tony-winning performance as Dolly Levi in Hello, Dolly, Channing built a persona defined by exaggeration. Enormous, wide-open eyes rimmed in heavy makeup, an oversized red lipstick smile, and a platinum wig, all paired with a raspy, gravelly voice that seemed to belong to an entirely different person than the face delivering it. Her Tonight Show appearances leaned fully into that theatricality. Channing performed like a live-action cartoon character, exaggerated gestures, wide-eyed reactions, and a booming stage presence that filled the studio even in an ordinary conversation. It made her simultaneously one of the most beloved and most parroted performers of her generation. Channing's approach differed from every other comedian on this list. She wasn't hiding flaws or confronting audiences with them. She was inflating conventional glamour itself until it became absurd, proving that exaggeration could be just as subversive as rejection. She continued performing on Broadway and in cabaret well into her 90s and remained a beloved fixture of American entertainment until her death in 2019 at age 97, the final word in an era of performers who understood that the audience wasn't there for perfection. They were there to laugh, and these 7 women, each in her own way, gave them every reason to. If this journey through Johnny Carson's most unforgettable guests moved you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this waiting to be told.